Okay, we are going to work on our cuffs on our tailored shirt right now. So when your placket is complete and you're happy with your placket, then you'll insert your sleeves into your side seams. So when your sleeve is all completed and ready to go, you are now going to put the pleats in the bottom of your sleeve. And if you look at your guide sheet, that's the first step in where you're going to get ready to do your cuffs. So I have down here on the bottom of my sleeve, you can see there are 4 little clips. That is marking where my pleat marks were. And so I will fold from the right side, looking at the right side of my fabric. I fold one clip over to the other clip and line those up to create my pleat, and it should pleat in the same direction that the placket closes on the shirt. And so you are going to fold that pleat from clip to clip and pin that in place so that as you lay that, your finger could go back inside the pleat, and then underneath your placket, the upper thing of your placket there. And then you will baste those pleats in place so that they stay in place as we go to sew that placket in, So we'll go to the sewing machine and we will baste those pleats in place. All right, so those pleats that are pinned in place need to be basted now. And so I'm just going to put the machine on a basting stitch and baste across those pleats just inside the seam allowance. So you want to be between that 1/2 inch and 5/8 inch seam allowance so that the basting winds up inside, but the pleat is held in place while you put that cuff on. And so you will baste that, and then you'll be ready to attach your cuff. With those pleats basted in place, you're now ready to get your cuff ready to sew on. If you look at your guide sheet, it tells you to attach your sewing interfacing to the wrong side of your cuff. And I am using a different fabric actually for my cuff and my cuff facing, so it'll be really easy for you to see and follow which one is which and not get lost in the print. And so I have basted at 1/4 inch. I've basted the interfacing to my cuff onto the wrong side of my cuff so that it is ready to go. And then this plain green piece of fabric will be my cuff facing. And then if you look at your guide sheet, it just tells you to, with the right sides together now, pin and attach the cuff to the cuff facing. But we need to allow for that turn of cloth. This cuff is going to go around your wrist. And because it goes around your wrist, the inside of that fabric does not need to go as far as the outside of that fabric does. You have to allow for the turn of cloth. And so as you pin the cuff to the cuff facing, we are going to, instead of line this up like your guide sheet tells you to, and it tells you to line this up exactly and then to fold the top seam allowance of your cuff facing down 5/8 of an inch. We are going to leave those lined up and aligned as they are, and then I want you to pull that cuff facing out, and if you can look, there's 1/8 of an inch of the cuff facing sticking out, just that little bit there. And I want you to pin your cuff to your cuff facing right sides together with 1/8 of an inch extended on that cuff facing so that edge will favor. If you look, the bottom and the top of the cuff are totally aligned. It's just the ends. And so do one end, flip it over, pin the other end, again pulling that out, that 1/8 of an inch, and pinning it in place. Now you will notice that then at the bottom we've got a little gap there. So in order to pin the bottom, you are going to give your fabric a pull and stretch that fabric just a little bit so that the cuff and the cuff facing now are the same length. And so you can do this taking advantage of your corkboard, pinning into your corkboard and pulling against it, or working with another person and have them hold the cuff as you pin that. But you're going to stretch and pull and pin that cuff into place so that the cuff and the cuff facing are the same length. And then when that cuff facing relaxes, it's actually going to make that cuff roll and curl in a circle, and that's what we're after. And so you are going to pin that with that pulled. When I'm doing it myself, sometimes I will pin it and then, or pull it and grab the center, and then I'm within a space where I can hold it myself, pick up a pin and pull that in. That's a little bit more difficult to do yourself. It'll be easier if you pin that with a partner. So I'm going to go ahead and pin, and then we'll get back together. All right, so I have pulled and pinned this bottom edge, the style edge of my cuff. Notice the curved edge, so it's the bottom of the cuff, the top of that cuff, the top edge is still open. I've pulled and stretched that. If you look, it tends to make this cuff want to roll up a little bit, which is when I'm wearing it, it's going to roll around the wrist. So that edge is favored. Then we are going to stitch this 5/8 of an inch around that outside edge and put our seam together. And it's 5/8 of an inch from your cuff piece, not your cuff facing. So your facing is actually going to stick out or extend beyond where you're sewing. If it helps you, once you're pinned and you're sure it's going to align well and you're sure it's going to roll around the sleeve and lay smooth, you can check this by even actually putting this over a sleeve roll and just fold that cuff around it. Make sure that that top edge lays smooth. If you look at that, you can see the top edge lays smooth. There's not a bubble. If you are good with that, then you can come back if you choose to, and you can now trim that cuff facing seam allowance so that it matches the seam allowance of the cuff, and then just truly sew at 5/8 of an inch. If that is going to make it a little bit easier for you, go ahead and use that technique. Just trim that cuff facing back down to match the cuff after you've got that edge favored, and then you can sew now at 5/8 of an inch rather than sew across the bottom and then have to either truly have pulled it out evenly at that 1/8 of an inch and move to 6/8, or risk not having it be quite the right size. And so for a lot of people, it's easier to trim that. And so you will trim both sides so that you can stitch at 5/8, and then you'll be ready to sew. We are now ready to sew the cuff to the cuff facing, the interfaced cuff to the cuff facing. Again, if you look at your guide sheet, it has told you to fold that seam allowance down at 5/8 of an inch and begin to sew, and your seam allowance will get caught in there. We are going to leave that up so that we can do a sandwich seam. Okay? So I'm going to sew from the cuff side up here, and if you take advantage of this line across the front of your presser foot, that is 5/8 of an inch, and I can drop a 5/8 inch seam allowance across the top and be 5/8 from the side and go ahead and put my needle down and now turn the direction to which I'm going to sew. Slide that over and be sure I'm down that 5/8 of an inch. Okay. And you are going to do what's called a terminated seam, which means I'm not starting at the edge of the fabric. I'm starting and stopping 5/8 of an inch away. So I will begin sewing. Gotta go back to regulation. And then back stitch. And you've got to kind of pay attention and be sure that you get back stitched exactly to that 5/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to continue and sew down around the cuff. And because I trimmed that seam from the cuff facing out, I can truly just sew at 5/8 of an inch. Now, the style edge of your cuff here is a curve. If your fabric is quite lightweight, and mine's a quite lightweight flippy floppy fabric, I am actually going to lower my stitch length just a little bit. So instead of being at 2.5, I'm going to drop it down to 2 as I go around the curve of this cuff, so that as I trim and grade afterwards and turn this out with a little tiny bit shorter stitch length, I'm less likely to get what I call stop signs or a couple of sharp points on the curve. I just want to make sure that my curve is truly smooth. Now that I'm around that curve, I'll go back to a true regulation. And now as I sew, I'm going to pull in front and behind. Allow the sewing machine to still use the feed dogs and pull the fabric through. But remember, the length of my cuff and the length of my cuff facing, as I sew along the style edge here, are a little bit different. I stretched the cuff, or I stretched the cuff facing to match the cuff because I pulled that out. And so in order to have it sew and not get a tuck underneath there, I've got to be certain that I have pulled this to distribute that little bit of ease, the 1/8 of an inch on both sides, equally around the entire length of that edge. Okay, as I approach my other corner, or my other curve there, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to change my stitch length just a little bit. It's not down to a reinforcement stitch at all. It's just down to the 2, so that as I go around this curve, I have a little bit better chance of not getting a sharp point or a sharp edge on that curve. And I want to stay, as soon as I get around that curve again, go back to my true regulation and sew up the opposite side of my cuff. I am also going to have a terminated seam here, which means I'm going to end 5/8 of an inch from the top here. So as I sew to the top, I've got to pay attention. This line on the front of your stitch plate here is 5/8 of an inch from the needle, and so I'm going to sew until my fabric hits there, reverse, and backstitch so that I've got a terminated seam. And then if you look at that, I have stopped sewing 5/8 of an inch from that top edge on both sides, and I've got terminated seams there and a curved edge. And then we're going to be ready to do some trimming and grading. Okay, so we have our cuff that is sewn, and again it's going to tend to look just a little bit bubbled because this fabric is really going to turn and roll, and it will lay smooth when it's rolled. It will not lay smooth when it's folded out. So don't be concerned if it looks a little bit like it's bubbled. You want it to lay smooth when we get the cuff actually rolled into place here. So now we need to trim and grade, and the cuff itself needs to be 3/8 of an inch. So if you basted your interfacing at 1/4 of an inch, you should be able to just literally come back and trim right on that basting line. And by doing that, it actually trims my cuff to 3/8 of an inch. So that is why we have you baste interfacing on at 1/4 of an inch rather than a lot of guide sheets will tell you to baste it at 1/2 an inch. It works, you can do that, but then you have to go back and unpick all your basting in order to trim and grade. So this just saves you a step to trim the cuff itself to 3/8 of an inch. Then you will come back and you will trim the cuff facing, so turn it over, and you will trim the cuff facing to 1/4 of an inch. And so as you look at that, you can see I've got 1/8 of an inch of cuff, that the printed fabric sticking out beyond my cuff facing there because I'm trimming that cuff facing to 1/4 of an inch. And when I trim different lengths or different pieces of fabric to different lengths, then it's called grading. And then you are going to trim the interfacing down to 1/8 of an inch, or as close as you can get it down to the stitching where it's applied, because we want to basically reduce the bulk of that piece of interfacing. And so I'm just going to take my scissors and lay them a little bit on the side there and trim my interfacing piece very, very close to the stitching so that I basically that little bit of 1/8 of an inch or less. So my interfacing will be down to 1/8 of an inch, my cuff will be 3/8 of an inch, and my cuff facing is 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to trim all the way around the style edge. I'm going to leave the top edge untrimmed. Okay, so after the style edge of the cuff has been trimmed and graded, the interfacing has been graded to the 1/8 of an inch, the cuff itself to 3/8, and the cuff facing to 1/4. These round curves need to be pinked so that it can be notched. And so you're just going to take a pair of pinking shears and pink that curved edge. And I like to pink each layer separately so that the notches will most likely be slightly offset from each other. That just like when you notched your Princess seam sample and you offset those clips and notches, if you notch all the way through all your layers of fabric, you will get weaker areas on your seam where the little triangles go in toward your seam. It actually weakens that spot of the seam through all your layers, and you're more likely to get a stop sign or little flat edges or poked edges on the curve. So if you'll take the time and trim those separately, you will actually have a little bit better and smoother curve when the time comes. And so I just take and trim those separately. So now that you've trimmed and graded that, then if you look at your guide sheet tells you to turn your cuff right side out. But if you look at that and you turn that cuff right side out, you basically kind of get a little bit of bubble on that seam. We want that bottom seam to be really, really crisp. And if you will take just a few minutes and actually press that seam open before you turn this right side out, you will get a crisper look when you're through. One of the tools that you can use to do that with is actually a sleeve roll that you can put up here on the corner or up inside that cuff to press that seam. I'll turn that around here. So if we press the seam, that style edge, and notice as I press, I'm only keeping the iron out in the seam allowance. I don't want to press on top of my cuff because remember we had favored that cuff and the two pieces of fabric are different lengths inside there. And so I'm pressing that flat as it was sewn to set the stitch. And then I'm going to come back and press it open. And there are a variety of options of tools that you can use. You can just take the sleeve roll here and get, turn that iron the other direction, so that I am pressing that seam open. That can help you get up inside of the cuff. You might also want to use the point presser along the long edge of the cuff here, the long edge of the style edge. You could pop that up on top of the point presser and get your seam open. The point presser can only be used on the straight parts, can't be used on the curve, but it does make it so that you can press those straight edges of that cuff and help define that seam a little bit. So I take the time to press this. When the time comes, it will favor just a little bit easier. So I pressed that open. Another thing then after I pressed it open that I like to do just on this bottom style edge is now reach the iron up inside and press the seam towards the facing. So I pressed it flat, I pressed it open, and then I pressed that seam just up inside that cuff along that long style edge towards the facing. And that will help as now I roll this right side out. Remember what it looked like before where there was a kind of a bubble along that style edge, so it lays flat and you don't see that bubble. If you look on the inside, by pressing that seam just towards it, you can see just a teeny tiny little hair of fabric from the cuff there, so that my cuff facing is favored. My seam as I'm wearing this cuff will be up inside and you will not see it at all from the outside of the shirt, and that's what we want. The ends here are going to tend to auto favor and pull themselves in because remember this green piece of fabric, my cuff facing is actually shorter than my cuff, and it is going to tend to pull that around and favor that edge automatically. One of the things I like to do to get the curve to come out is I take the what we often use to poke the collars out, this point turner, and use the back side of it, the rounded edge, and take that rounded edge and just push it against my curve. And if I just roll that curve back and forth, it helps to give me a nice smooth curve that I can then press and make sure it stays favored. And so I like to take the back of the point turner and just use that back edge against the curve and get that curve pulled out. Okay. And now I'm going to press this over a sleeve roll, the direction that it's going to be going, because it tends to curve a little bit, so it will press easier on a curved surface or a rounded surface. And take that edge and press that edge. Be careful to check on the inside that you are just truly leaving that barely favored style edge on the inside. It's on the bottom where you can't see it. Pressing on the top of fabric like this, you would be using a press cloth, but if I cover this all up, you can't see what I'm doing. So I'm not pressing with a press cloth. Okay. Be careful, if you look here, you can see the green is coming up with my cuff facing. I've got to be certain that I roll that back to the inside again. And line that up and press that outside edge. But I want to make certain that I've got a pretty good favored edge there ready to go. And then if you turn it on the inside, if you turn it to the inside, you can now see I've got just a very slightly favored edge all the way on that inside there. Okay. At this point now, if you look at your guide sheet, it tells you now to pin the cuff right sides together to your sleeve. And the picture in your guide sheet is going to have this top edge of the style edge sewn down into place. It's going to be sticking so you can see it. Ours is floating free, and you will see why we want ours floating free when the time comes. So you are going to pin this to your edge. If you're doing the men's shirt, that your cuffs will be basted in place like you saw just a minute ago. If you are doing the ladies' shirt, you don't want to pre-baste those cuffs. And so this is a lady sleeve. I don't want to pre-baste those cuffs or pre-baste those pleats on if you're doing the ladies' shirt, because we inserted a different placket than what the pattern called for. The cuff doesn't quite fit exactly the way that it would have otherwise. And so the very first place that you're going to pin, you are going to line up this edge of the cuff with your placket, right sides together. And I'm going to pin this in place. And if you look, you want to barely be able to see that cuff seam out, what would be one more stitch beyond there. You want to just barely see that. And it will make you easier if you'll just pin both sides. And again, if you are doing the men's shirt, the cuff will exactly fit the shirt because you have already basted your pleats in place. So you'll put these 2 pins in, making sure that that cuff facing is hanging down and out of space and out of place there, and making sure that you just have a little bit more than a fingernail distance of your cuff hanging out beyond the edge of your placket. Literally barely a fingernail's distance. And then you'll pin this across, matching up your notches again. Matching up the style edge, just like your guide sheet tells you to, so that it is aligned. Okay. Now, if you're doing the ladies' shirt, and if you just put the pleats in where it says, you're going to find you have extra fabric if you had just basted those pleats in. So we have to resize the 2 pleats to fit in the space between the notches. And so basically you kind of fold the pleat and fold the pleat, and they wind up in the same size, and if you use the first clip of your pleat and fold it back to the edge of your placket, you'll find you have a pleat between the placket and the notch, and then your second pleat goes over the top of your notch, if that makes sense. So there was my first clip. I used that clip, but rather than lining the clips, I went clear back to almost to where the placket is. And then my second pleat starts there near my notch. And I make those pleats larger than what it called for in order for my shirt, my sleeve, to lay flat on the cuff. And then I'm going to pin those into place, turn the shirt right side out and look at them, make sure that they look and are the same size. You can measure those pleats, make sure they're the same size. Come to the right side here, and the same thing that we talked about before, you've got to make sure that your finger would go into the pleat, finger would go into the pleat, and then finger would go into your placket as it overlaps there, so that your pleats fold and turn in the correct direction. Make certain that you don't make that pleat if you're doing the lady's shirt cover up any of that placket. You want to be sure that you just barely meet it and don't cover it up. And so if you need to, play with those a little bit and get those even. When you're happy with it, then we're going to sew. A lot of times before I sew, I like to put a second pin just down here so that my placket stays parallel to the edge of my cuff. And you can see I have just one fingernail width of cuff that extends out beyond that placket, so that you can just barely see it. That is going to allow for the turn of cloth after this placket has been, or after this cuff has been sewn to the cuff facing. And just so that it doesn't slip or slide, I will quite often just put a second pin down there and make sure that my placket is laying exactly parallel to the edge of my cuff. Then I'm ready to sew this on. And I'm going to sew it from the cuff side. I want my cuff facing to stay out of the way. And if you remember that terminated seam, if I pull this cuff back out and get the seam out of the way, that terminated seam, you can see I ended my stitching right there, coming up the edge of my cuff. I am going to drop the needle in that point right there. And so you'll put fabric under the presser foot and you drop the needle right in that terminated seam. You've got to end in that exact point. And so you will start sewing and backstitch right to that same point again, and you are just simply sewing this 5/8 inch seam, attaching the cuff to the sleeve, being careful not to catch the cuff facing. And again, you can see I've got my cuff facing separate. If you look at your guide sheet, remember that edge was turned under, and so you will have a folded edge sitting under here rather than a raw edge looking at it. But I am just pulling that cuff facing out of the way, sewing the cuff seam to the bottom of my sleeve. Notice I periodically pick it up underneath and make sure I don't have a tuck. And you can see that I'm kind of feeling those edges with my fingers, making sure that the fabric is smooth underneath there, making sure my pleats have stayed the right direction. As I head towards the other edge of the cuff, towards that other side, you can see I'm approaching again. There's my seam, and there's my terminated seam. I'm going to point out with the seam ripper. My seam coming up, and there's that terminated seam. And I want to end exactly at that point. I'm going to come and take out the last pin. And sew and terminate at exactly that spot. So if you look at that, you can see that they met right there at the corner. That's what you want to have happen. And you don't want to catch your seams. You want to have all your seams free from each other. You want to make sure that those were not caught. Okay. All right. When that is sewn, now you want to pull out the cuff from the jacket. Make sure that the cuff comes straight up to the placket. And if you wrap that around, that the cuff is coming straight up from the placket, that they exactly meet each other and are straight. You don't want to have a tuck in your placket, or you don't want the cuff to be sticking out on the edge. When that's good and you're sure your pleats are heading the right direction, we're now ready to make a sandwich seam and finish off that turned edge. Okay, I want you to think back to when you put the yoke on your shirt. You were introduced to what was called a sandwich seam. And if you remember, a sandwich seam is a seam where you would be putting two pieces of fabric right sides together, but a third piece is inserted into the middle. And the two pieces of fabric would be like your bread on a sandwich. That third piece would be the peanut butter and the jam or the bologna. We are now going to sew that top edge of our cuff to our cuff facing just for 1 inch. We're going to sew about 1 inch is all. And so I need to go right sides together. If I bring those right sides together, you can see that my shirt or my sleeve there, it winds up sandwiched in the middle. And so all I'm going to do Here's my cuff, right side of my cuff. Here's right side of cuff facing. I'm going to bring those around, line those top edges up, and my sleeve is actually sandwiched in the center. Okay, so I've brought that around. And if you sew it from the cuff side, you are literally going to sew right on top of your same stitching line. Okay. So I brought that edge around. I'm going to do one at a time rather than do them both. It's maybe a little bit easier if you pin one and sew it, and then pin the second one and sew it. So that's what I'm going to do for you. I've got that pinned, it lays smooth. I checked from both sides, it's laying smooth. Then come back to the sewing machine. Okay, back at the sewing machine, I am just going to literally sew from that same spot that I sewed last time where it met. I will backstitch there, and I'm just going to sew for about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. And so you drop your needle right back at that intersection again, where that terminated seam was. Sew forward, backstitch. And then I just sew just for that inch, being very careful not to go beyond it because I don't want to tuck my fabric. I sew right on top of my stitching and trim my thread so that I've got that sandwich seam there. Then I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. Okay, so I've got a sandwich seam on one side of my cuff. You can see I've created that seam there and pulled it out. I'm now going to make a sandwich seam on the other side. Same idea. The sandwich seam is taking the right side of my cuff to the right side of my cuff facing. The sleeve itself is the sandwich, so all I'm going to do is bring my cuff facing around my cuff, making sure now that I've got right sides together, that it's laying smooth, laying even. The top edges are aligned with each other. And you can feel it between your thumb and your finger. You can just run between your thumb and your finger and make sure there isn't a tuck there. Make sure it lays smooth. As long as it lays smooth, go ahead and pin the other side. And again, you are only going to sew for about 1 inch to that corner, and you are going to sew right on top of your same stitching line. And so I have got cuff sewn to cuff facing right sides together, but I have my sleeves sandwiched in between there. And when you're certain that that lays smooth and that you don't have anything tucked inside of there, you are then going to go back and sew the other side, the second side, just like we sewed a minute ago. So back to the sewing machine. Okay, so you're back to the sewing machine. Line up the needle and the presser foot so that you are right on top of your stitching. Drop that needle down, and you're just really, truly going to sew literally right on top of that seam that you made, attaching your cuff to your cuff facing, and being very careful again to terminate the seam exactly at that corner. Then you can check and make certain that your sandwich seam corners you didn't catch anything by pulling it out, looking at it, and it should come out square and come out square. Now it's going to be a little bit bulky because we haven't trimmed and graded, but you should come out square and it should lay flat. If that's all good, then we're going to be ready now to trim and grade this last seam and then close up your cuff. We've got to make sure that that lays smooth. And that looks like it lays fairly smooth, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward now with finishing the cuff. Those look pretty good. They come out pretty straight. So I'm going to pull this again inside out so that I can see my seam. And now I'm going to trim and grade that top edge. I'm going to talk just a little bit about why we did what we just did as opposed to what the guide sheet said to do. Your guide sheet would have had you with this seam pulled down in place, and when you turned it right side out and after you trimmed and graded, you would either be hand stitching this closed or edge stitching it closed with a trimmed and graded seam already. And the risk of that is a very, very weak corner that frays out. What we have is a totally stitched corner that can be trimmed and graded and then pulled out and smooth without the risk of everything fraying. So that is why we did that, so it'll allow us to trim and grade after we've sewn that edge rather than sew the edge and now be trying to stitch on a trimmed and graded seam. So we're going to take this top edge and we're going to trim our cuff and our cuff facing just like we did before. This is a corner, 90-degree corner, so it gets cut diagonally across the corner, and you can truly just cut that and cut fairly close to the stitching because remember it's backstitched to the edge and taken care of. And then I'm going to take my cuff and trim it to 3/8, and you will trim it just like you trimmed the style edge of the cuff. Trim right along your basting line. That will trim your cuff to 3/8. When all is said and done, your cuff seam is going to be the longest, so it needs to be 3/8. Your sleeve seam that is sandwiched in between there needs to be 5/16. And then you are going to leave your cuff facing untrimmed other than the corner edge here for just a minute, then we'll come back and trim it to the 1/4 of an inch. And so your cuff again is 3/8, your sleeve is 5/16, and your inner facing is going to be that 1/8 of an inch, or lay the scissors on the side and trim it as close as you can get it. So I'm going to trim and grade for a minute and then we'll chat again about what's going on. Okay, so I've trimmed my cuff to 3/8, trimmed my inner facing to the 1/8, trimmed the sleeve down to the 5/16, and now I'm going to again come back now and just look at my corner. Remember I trimmed that diagonally, and now I'm going to swoop cut and take just a little bit more fabric out from that corner so that I get a really good sharp corner when I pull that out. Okay. Then I'm going to do the same thing with the opposite corner. Come back and trim that diagonally. Notice when I do that, I always put my thumbnail right on that intersection so that I can't cut too close and cut a hole in my cuff. And so I stick my hand there, which does not allow me then to cut and make a hole in the corner of that cuff, but lets me get very, very close. Okay. Now it pulls out very easily right sides out. If you just hold on to your placket and pull that corner comes out and it pulls out very smooth and very easy now that it's been trimmed and graded, and lays very, very smooth, and the placket comes right out of the corner and looks very, very nice. That's what we're after. And by doing that and trimming and grading and sewing it the way that we did, you saw how close I was able to cut and trim, but that corner is already sewed and it's sturdy and durable rather than trying now to come back with a needle and thread and hand sew that little trimmed edge under. So that is why we did the sandwich seam method rather than following the exact directions that your pattern guide said. All right, the last thing that has to happen here is we've got to close up this hole. And so we need to have this seam allowance pressed down into the shirt. So you would press it flat as it is. Again, if your fabrics are different, like you may want to press that seam open or even finger press it open to define that edge, and then head it down towards the inside. Remember, my cuff and my sleeve have been trimmed and graded. My cuff facing is not yet. And the reason I didn't just trim that cuff facing down to 1/4 of an inch is if I wasn't totally accurate as I sewed, I maybe sewed a little bit crooked or pinned a little bit crooked. If I turn this edge under and trim it to 1/4 of an inch and I didn't sew quite right, I might need some of that fabric that I already cut off. And so what we're going to do now is come back and with this bottom edge that we've already pressed, okay, remember that bottom style edge, I'm going to just give it another quick press because I've been messing with it, okay, to make sure that style edge stays where it belongs. And then I'm going to come up now and turn the cuff facing under so that my folded edge here barely covers my stitching line. Okay, I don't want it down here, don't want any, I mean that looks ridiculous, you'd have raw edges sewing. don't want it turned way up high above the cuff here so that it comes above it. I want to literally make it barely meet the stitching line. And so I'm going to turn that edge under and then press it. And you kind of have to go in little sections here because remember your cuff tends to want to roll, so it's only going to stay flat in a little piece. You can't line the whole edge up at once. You can see as soon as I move over, this folded edge tends to want to come up. I can only get a flat piece in a little section at a time. So I get that section where I want it, press that little section, move my cuff over, make sure that seam is pressed down. Again, depending upon your fabric, you may be able to finger press that like you watched me do, or you may need to actually use your iron and press that before you start here. And I just move over in little sections, pressing this and getting that seam turned under at that 1/4 inch. Okay. When it's turned under the 1/4 inch, take just a minute, come back, look at it, make sure it's smooth, make sure it rolls. You can even take just a second and come back over your sleeve roll and make sure that this cuff is going to lay smooth over the top as it gets rounded. If you're pleased with that, now you're going to come back, get back inside here, and trim the cuff facing to a 1/4 inch from that fold line, because now I know exactly where my fold line needed to be to cover up my seam. And so I'll just pop that back out. And yes, it takes just a second to have turned it right side out to press it and then take it back inside out to trim it. But if you didn't sew accurately and you need more fabric than what you had after you trimmed, it takes a lot longer to completely take the cuff back off and start over than it did to just take this off now and trim it to the 1/4 inch. And so you can see there's my fold line, and I just trim this seam allowance to a 1/4 inch from that fold line. That my cuff facing is going to be the seam allowance that's closest to my body, and so it is the one that is the shortest. Once it's trimmed, I just pull it right side out again, and my seam is totally trimmed and graded with the widest to the world. Okay, now I'm going to pin this hole closed. This is a little bit tricky in that, again, it doesn't want to lay flat, and so you kind of have to pin it and allow it to continue to roll a little bit as it pins. You've got to allow it to not lay flat. And you can see here again that it's doing just that. It is tending to roll and it isn't laying flat. If you try to pull it out flat, you're going to wind up with a bubble because this piece of fabric is shorter than that outside edge is. It wants to lay rolled, and so as you pin this, you've got to have that so that it's curling a little bit. Okay. I stuck the first pins in that direction. For some of you, it may be easier to pin from the other side, so I'm going to show you that now. You can roll it up. Again, keep it just a little bit curved as you pin. For some people, this is easier because if you've got the edge of the fabric right lined up with your seam, the actual action of putting the pin in and tipping it that direction makes it so it barely covers your seam allowance. And for some people, that is a little bit more helpful. So again, I can come up, line up the seam allowance. When I put that pin in and tip it, it pulls the seam so that it's barely covering that seam allowance, which is what we're after here. Don't want that thread. So when it's pinned in place, it lays smooth. You can come to the outside, make sure the outside edge, that seam line is crisp, doesn't have any tucks in it. Your seam tends to want to roll that direction. We're then ready to stitch the hole closed. So we'll go to the sewing machine and we'll stitch that hole closed. when you come to your sewing machine, you're going to want to take off your table so that you just have your narrow arm here. This is actually going to be easier to sew, sewing from the right side with the cuff itself actually rolled or pulled around the arm of your sewing machine. Because remember, the cuff facing is a little bit shorter than the cuff. Your cuff tends to want to be rolled around a wrist. If you try to sew it from this side, rolling it backwards, you are taking the short piece and trying to make it go the longer distance, and you will get a tuck, I promise. So the hardest part about this is the hole is on the inside. We are sewing from the outside, and that is why we pinned it so that it barely covered the stitching line. And we are going to edge stitch. Remember, edge stitching should be sewn from the face up. Because it's on the face, I am not back stitching. I want to leave a thread tail. It should be 1/8 of an inch or less away from the seam allowance. The first inch is fairly easy to do because it was sewed close. Grab my pin out from underneath there. As you go, you don't want to sew over the pins, so you are going to have to reach up underneath and take the pins out as you get to them. You can see, by the way I'm holding this, I'm kind of much like when I sewed the bottom edge here and I talked about stretching in front and behind. I'm doing somewhat the same thing here, holding in front and behind, keeping that curve in there, and then reaching up inside and taking out the pins. But I'm holding behind it and in front of it, stretching that just a little bit because my cuff and my cuff facing are different sizes, but I'm stretching it actually around that arm of the sewing machine to help favor that curve going around my wrist. The fact that it's got to close around my wrist. So I'm keeping that hold as it goes around the wrist. To the other side, set at the edge, and then cut and leave a thread tail that I'm going to pull through and tie a knot. I don't want to back stitch because this shows on the right side. Check on the inside, make sure that you cut at every place, that it is closed on the inside, and it should be fairly close again to an edge stitching on that inside. It should be fairly close to, can you see that? If you look at that, it looks like it's edge stitching on the inside, and you want it to be, it should be fairly straight on both sides. Check your cuff, make sure that it's smooth. You can actually put your arm up inside there, make sure that it comes around your wrist, lay smooth, that the inside your cuff facing isn't bubbling. As long as you're good with that, then you'll pull those 2 threads through and tie a knot. And then your last step is to stitch your outside edge, your style edge, with whatever stitching you did on your button band, either edge stitching or top stitching on this outside button band edge. And I edge stitched mine, so I will edge stitch my button band here as well as soon as I get my knots tied. So I like to, just before I either edge stitch or top stitch that style edge, pin it so that my favorite edge stays to the inside, and I'm going to drop my needle right there in the edge stitching that went along the top of my cuff, and then I'm going to edge stitch along the style edge here. Again, it's showing on the right side, so I'm not going to back stitch. If you like to use the number 5 foot or the number 10 foot to edge stitch, you certainly can. Like I've said before, I sewed many years without one of those and became accustomed to edge stitching without it. So I'm not going to take the time to change the foot out, but if you like to sew with a number 5 foot or number 10 foot to edge stitch, certainly go ahead and change the foot out. You may need to do the same thing we've talked about before, kind of hold in front and behind, give that cuff a little bit of a pull as you head across that bottom style edge, because your cuff facing is slightly shorter than the cuff. as you head around the corner. One thing that sometimes will help, if you look at where my hand is placed, sitting out here to the side, I'm actually pivoting my finger, or pivoting my fabric with my fingers out there to get it to go around that corner smoothly. And then head up this last edge. And I want to stop right in my stitching. There we go. And then leave a thread tail so that I can turn that. Okay, so that completes the cuff. Again, the pleats are heading the right direction. The pleats head towards, so the pleat goes the same direction that the placket does. The cuff is favored so that it tends to want to roll. Okay, it doesn't want to stay flat. It lays smooth when it's rolled. It doesn't lay smooth when it's flat. And your cuff is done. You just have to tie your last knots, and you are through. Do 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 do.